Good morning. I'm Sylvester Johnson, Director of the Center for Humanities, and I want to welcome you to this panel on local disasters, global concerns, crisis communication solutions to local and global disasters. I want to introduce Professor Sweta Bania, who will be introducing our panelists. Professor Bania is an Assistant Professor of Rhetoric, Professional and Technical Writing at Virginia Tech and at the Department of English, and her research centers around transnational disaster response, non-Western and feminist rhetorics, as well as community engagement. She studies the emergence of transnational assemblages and networked communities that are critical during local disasters. And her scholarship is informed via non-Western rhetorical traditions and practices that she acquired via her community in Nepal. Dr. Bania has taught classes at Virginia Tech in the past that have used digital platforms to engage with international communities and a particular partner named Code for Nepal. And her students have also served as teachers and as learners in rural communities of Nepal by producing user-based documents to assist them in gaining digital literacy. Today, students from her fall 2021 semester course are presenting their work on local disasters, global concerns. So Professor Sweta Bania, I'm excited that you're here, and I'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Namaste, everyone. First, I would like to do land acknowledgement. I acknowledge the Tutelo Monacan people who are traditional custodians of the land on which we work, live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tutelo Monacan nations and their elders, past, present, and emerging. And at the very beginning, I would like to thank Dr. Sylvester Johnson for providing us with this platform to present research findings and recommendations on local, regional, and global disasters. Likewise, I would also like to thank Center for Communicating Science for providing me and my collaborator, Daniel Taban, with a small grant to work together with the students this semester. Thank you, Dr. Rebecca Weaver-Hightower, Dr. Jim Jawinski, and Dr. Jen Money for providing me a platform to teach at Virginia Tech, and especially this course. And thank you, Dominique Francisca, for organizing all this. She is behind everything today. As world continues to suffer through climate change, environmental, and other crises like a pandemic, there is an urgency for various scholars in the fields to explore how global communications and interdisciplinary practices can help to address injustices in the contemporary networked world. A disaster, as we all know, shifts geography, people, and culture, yet it also initiates movement in space and causes various networks to form, creating local space for global stakeholders to act. Larger scale crises create disruptions and create threats to living beings and their well-being, along with natural or infrastructural damages. The multifaceted effects of a disaster among the most vulnerable and marginalized are always to the extreme. Hence, our class, Ignis 4874, Issues in Professional and Public Discourses, was grounded in social justice and feminist-oriented communication and disaster response that could create inclusive strategies and culturally responsible as well as socially justice-oriented communication strategies. Specifically, this course focused on writing in and about addressing global issues such as climate change, disasters, via risk and crisis communication from the perspective of social justice. Communicating during a crisis has never been so important given the current challenges of the world. Throughout the semester, we explored practical strategies that any organization can develop to address situations of crisis that helps not only themselves, but also their communities. In today's presentations, the students will showcase their research on 3 different disasters and their impacts on the most vulnerable and marginalized communities. In addition, the students will also share some of their recommendations for crisis communication that includes aspects of social justice. The work that students are presenting today is also focused on how technical communicators can rethink communication practices in understanding the effects of disaster among the most vulnerable and marginalized populations locally, regionally, and globally. So today we have Kate Stafford and Liz Kaufman who will be presenting on fighting flooding and famine in South Sudan, consequences of climate change, literacy and violence on disaster communication. Second, we have Kylie Call and Leah Van Blarcom, who will be presenting the story behind women and COVID-19, gender-focused crisis communication during pandemic. And lastly, we have Haley Wade and Christine Dean, who will be presenting on analysis of a Facebook group during 2020 California Lake Fire, how grassroots organizers communicate during crisis. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us. Kate and Liz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Bonilla. We'll just share our screen quickly. Okay. As Dr. Bonilla said, the presentation title is Fighting Flooding and Famine in South Sudan, Consequences of Climate Change, Literacy, and Violence on Disaster Communication. I'm Kate Stafford. I am a senior in PTW.
I'm Liz Kaufman. I am also a senior in professional and technical writing. And we would like to thank the Center for Humanities and the Center for Communicating Science for making this presentation possible. And thank you all for being here today as well.
So in our presentation, first we'll go over the background and the crisis situation of what is occurring right now in South Sudan. And then we will look at our research objectives and our argument, and then our research methods and how we conducted research, our findings from that research, the recommendations we have, and our reflections on this project. So our background on the project is split into the major categories that we were studying, starting with climate change. The recent floods have been the worst in decades in South Sudan and have destroyed the country's farmland and homes, and it's displaced families and worsened the country's famine. And this displacement leads to fights over the dwindling usable farmland in a country where the majority of the population depend on agricultural production for their livelihoods. Climate change wasn't caused by South Sudan. It's a global disaster that's going to require a global response to mitigate its causes and its effects. And the floods and droughts have disrupted agricultural production in the region, causing this famine. And amidst the flooding and disaster, the UNHCR said that some had not eaten in days.
Literacy and women is the other category that we researched. So we found that there is a very low literacy rate in South Sudan, one of the lowest in almost all of the countries of the world. Roughly 26.8% of the people 15 years and older in South Sudan are literate. So forms of written communication just lack efficacy. Specifically for the women, especially, only 19% can read and write, while the literacy rate for men is 35%, meaning women are further disadvantaged when communication is written. Violence was the other category that we researched, and we found that in 2011, when South Sudan became its own country, businesses did want to take advantage of this new economy. And so people were establishing businesses that were foreigners, and it increased locals' resentment and jealousy because much of the people live in rural areas where it is just very poor. This increased economic insecurity and conflict. The violence also was increased by the flooding and famine because people were trying to find food anywhere they could go, and this caused fighting and conflict and competition over land and resources and clean water. As a result, violence is a common occurrence in this post-war stage. We even had a report that went as far as to say that the fatality rate was higher and exceeded what the rates were during the war.
So our research objectives in looking at South Sudan were to find out the causes and effects of flooding and famine regarding climate change and the international community, to find out what crisis communication strategies are most effective in countries with low literacy rates, and to find out what the best communication strategies are in areas experiencing violence.
We argue that disaster communication in South Sudan is and will remain inadequate until government and non-government organizations work together to establish a communication that all the people can use and understand. In this way, we want to increase women's agency and improve transnational national communication, because then all the people can communicate and understand each other and have reliable information. This transnational communication must push for a global effort to mitigate climate change and its effects, and is imperative to improving the conditions in South Sudan as well.
So our research methods, to begin conducting the research, we utilized Google Scholar and JSTOR to find peer-reviewed scholarly articles. And before searching through the articles, we made sure to set our browsers so it only showed articles posted after 2011, because that's when South Sudan established its independence. And out of those searches, we found 3 articles: the Ministry of Environment's Republic of South Sudan's National Adaptation Program of Actions, the NAPA to Climate Change, the Sud Institute's Climate Change and Conflicts in South Sudan, and the UN news story titled UNHCR Responding to Worst Flooding in Decades in South Sudan. Out of those articles, we found codes, which were recurrent words that express themes that we were interested in researching. So we found climate change, reforestation, famine, flooding, relief and aid, response, violence, tradition, schools, literacy, gender, transnational, and displacement. So in analyzing those codes, we organized them to try and figure out what their meanings were. And our findings were that climate change was often found near reforestation, flooding, and famine. Violence was found in proximity to gender and displacement. Literacy was found near schools, gender, and tradition. And lastly, relief and aid was found near flooding and famine. The realization whilst analyzing the codes was that relief and aid was not found in proximity to climate change, despite the need for international effort to mitigate the causes of the disaster, the climate change. The relief and aid was very much focused on the flooding and famine. So we wanted to focus our project on how the international community should be handling climate change as well. And our findings. Climate change, our first finding was that climate change caused flooding and famine have exacerbated the rate of displacement, further factionalizing South Sudanese people and increasing violence requiring an international response. So the link between climate change and violence means that to decrease violence, there needs to be a decrease in violence in climate change as well. And climate change, as we've said before, is not caused by South Sudan. It's caused by many nations, but it impacts South Sudan disproportionately. And the worsening floods and famine will lead to more South Sudanese people being displaced from their homes in search of basic needs like food, water, dry land, which will worsen the tension between citizens fighting over the diminishing land because they rely so heavily on agricultural production. So the competition is really high because of the food insecurity and the famine.
Our second finding was more related towards the actual communication happening in South Sudan. And we found that both local and international communication is actually burdening the crisis happening. Specifically for local communication, much of the communication happening is propelling the violence because there's so much dishonesty. The news quality is so poor. And the citizens that can read and write, they are getting these propaganda and this manipulative language that uses words like tactical withdrawal instead of defeat in order for sides to not lose their following. Furthermore, some facts are just flat out exaggerated. One report showed that they reported 500 people had died when really it was 26. But that kind of exaggeration causes a huge emotional response that just increases violence. And internationally, the communication has been quite the same. There's been accusations on both sides pertaining to the government as well as international communities. For example, the government of South Sudan at one point accused the United Nations of giving aid to the rebel forces, when really it was this big miscommunication that they had to clear with each other. And when something like that happens, you guys are, both communities are not working together for peace. So it's really just violence is really reigning, and the people are left without reliable and unbiased information. Our third finding was specifically towards the disparity between gender and literacy and how it represents deep social discrepancies that complicate crisis communication. Women's main source of communication, since their literacy rates are so low, is word of mouth and radio. Other forms of media are just incomprehensible, especially to the majority of South Sudanese women. Women are excluded from discourse surrounding disaster when they don't have good communication. And we found a report that talked about the gravity of this. And they said that their needs are not heard and they're left unmet, and disaster is exacerbated. In 2011, when South Sudan became its own country, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was established, and they promised to represent women equally in positions of power and in government. And we found from our research that the government has failed in every single promise to represent women in this way. So our recommendations are really centered towards women and giving them a voice. With that said, our first recommendation is to establish a reliable source of communication, specifically through radio, because this is a source of communication that can reach the people now, where they are, literacy rates and all, because you don't need to read and write to be able to talk. So we are hoping to establish local activists. We're hoping to establish workshops where local activists and community members are taught how to use radios and how to spread information through them. In this way, we're trying to create a partnership between the government of South Sudan and the United Nations in order for the citizens to see that their government is doing things to help them and hopefully establish trust slowly but surely.
We also recommend greater funding and research by international communities about climate change prevention strategies globally and locally in South Sudan. So the UN radio program that Liz mentioned that we are recommending will be focused on prioritizing personal narratives of the climate change caused disasters. And these personal narratives could be shared with the international community, amplifying South Sudanese voices and the way that climate change is affecting them. And we also recommend putting women in positions where they have rhetorical agency through the radio form of communication proposed, because when women's voices are heard, then their needs can be better understood and met.
We have a further outlined recommendation strategy page that we just don't have the time to go through, but if you would like to read more in depth about our recommendations, we do have that resource available.
And our reflections on this project as a whole, I felt like I didn't really understand what was happening in South Sudan. Most people, I think, aren't aware of the crises that are occurring. And they're so complex. And our research really just started with the famine and the floods, but we quickly learned that there were so many disasters occurring concurrently, and they were more extensive than we realized. So it was really interesting to get to do this research. And we wanted to thank Dr. Benia and this course and everything, because it really opened me up to an entire new side of professional and technical communication.
Yes, and similarly, we just found that the disaster happening in South Sudan is extremely complex and will require the full cooperation of so many different people, experts, leaders, citizens, internationally, locally. We found that money is not the solution entirely. Of course, it takes those resources to help, but climate change is not something that can be solved with just more money. And same here, it will take a whole lot of just cooperation and just people leaning into this problem. This research also just scratches the surface of what can be known about what's going on with these citizens. And we do just thank Dr. Benia for putting that to our attention and putting us in a position to care about this country that is so far from our own.
And we wanted to once again thank Dr. Sylvester Johnson and the Center for Humanities and Center for Communicating Science for making this possible. And we'd also like to thank Daniel Tobin and Scott Fralin for visiting our class and providing guidance with our project. And we would like to give an extra special thanks to Dr. Benia for all her hard work and for being such an amazing professor this semester. None of this would have been possible without her. So thank you, Dr. Benia. Here are references, and that is the end.
Thank you so much, both of you. It was a great presentation. I have shared a link of their site on the chat if you'd like to see. Now, Kylie and Leah, do you want to share?
I'll share my screen 1 second. Thank you. Okay, everyone. So today, Leah and I will be presenting the story behind women in COVID-19, gender-focused crisis communication during the pandemic. And we'll start off with a brief agenda. So like I said, Leah and I will be presenting this project. I'm Kylie Call. I'm a professional and technical writing major.
I'm Leah Van Blericom. I'm a professional technical writing and public relations double major.
So we're going to start off with a background of the role of storytelling during the COVID-19 pandemic, a background of the experience of vulnerable communities during the pandemic, an overview of our research objectives, a walkthrough of our research methodology, a presentation of our findings regarding the effectiveness of storytelling and crisis communication, an overview of recommendations for tailoring crisis communication towards vulnerable groups, an overview of our reflections on the projects, and a showcase of our web exhibition. And we just want to give a special thanks to the Center of Humanities and the Center for Communicating Science for making this project possible. So I'll start off with our introduction. 70.1% of Virginia residents have access to the internet. And you can see this globally, more and more people are gaining access to technology, and online media outlets are taking advantage of this. So they're relying on storytelling during the COVID-19 pandemic to promote preventative measures, such as vaccinations and mask wearing. And you can see this here in this article by the Daily Mail, which is about an anti-vax couple in Virginia passing away. So clearly this story, which interviews their children and family members, is to promote getting the vaccine. So although storytelling focuses more on the individual rather than hard facts and statistics, storytelling can provide more contextual information to navigate a crisis. And then we also found through our research that marginalized groups suffer more than non-marginalized groups during disasters because they're less likely to be addressed by government response tactics. They're also more vulnerable to disasters due to the following. So they rely on the informal economy at higher rates. So their jobs aren't overseen by the government. So there's little safety net for them, little access to social services or political influence, and limited opportunities to cope and adapt due to their circumstances. Failing to consider the needs of vulnerable communities during disasters demonstrates a lack of situational awareness, which results in inadequate decision-making regarding disasters because you're really only serving a few type of people or even one type of person instead of everyone. So our research objectives, we wanted to investigate the role of storytelling in crisis communication and management. Through our research, we aim to do the following. We wanted to demonstrate that storytelling is an effective crisis communication strategy tool, despite it, not relying as much as on hard facts and statistics, as I previously mentioned. We wanted to promote tailored crisis communication over universal crisis communication. So universal crisis communication, we think is less effective because it's one size fits all, whereas tailored crisis communication is adjusted to meet the specific needs of certain groups. So it's more effective in that it will better draw their attention and you're more likely to achieve the desired outcomes from those groups. And we also want to provide crisis communication recommendations that alleviate information and aid barriers and involve vulnerable groups in decision-making spaces during the pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis stages. So our research methods, we use Potts actor network theory, which views people, events, technology, and objects as actors in an experience during a disaster. And we made this diagram that showcases women's experiences during COVID-19 and how it's multifaceted. And then we gathered 9 articles that reflected this diagram and all of the actors, and we performed qualitative coding on each of the articles. We chose to do inductive qualitative coding, so we didn't go in with any predefined code sets. We read each article line by line and then coded phrases that you can see right here. And then we compiled our codes into this table. So after reading the articles twice, we found the following themes that really demonstrate, the idea behind our codes. So we found that storytelling exposes existing inequalities, reveals invisible trauma, and inspires hope among vulnerable groups. So at first in our research, we focused more on women, but then later on in this class, we expanded our subjects to include people with disabilities, the LGBTQIA+ community, and immigrants. So at first we found that women are more likely to face social and economic ramifications than men due to gender stereotypes. And they use language such as pay gap, abuse, childcare, C-section, pressing issues, and fragile system to describe how COVID-19 has really exposed existing inequalities. And in total, there were 35 references pertaining to this among all the articles. One woman even said, "I think COVID-19 has really magnified all the cracks that are in society." And we can apply this finding to our groups. One woman said, "I feel like I've taken a step back in my career. I never thought I would go part-time and not be able to move up in salary. This was a different route that I didn't plan on taking." So here she's describing how because of 40% of Virginia's childcare centers have closed, more and more women are staying at home due to deep-rooted gender stereotypes. And this is going to have long-term economic impacts on them because they're missing work experience, they're missing promotions. So this will have a long-term impact economically. And then a trans activist said, "A lot of times we as trans people are teaching our healthcare providers about us, and a lot of times there's not any access for us to healthcare." So here they're describing how trans people feel discriminated against in healthcare, that a lot of medical professionals don't really know how to treat them. And this has been going on for a long time, and it's aggravated by COVID-19, where getting quality healthcare is imperative. And then here, Bella Rowland, she lives in a community with a lot of immigrants, and she's speaking on their behalf. She says transportation is an issue. They don't have the ability to take time off of work to get there, or they have to take a bus for 2 hours to get somewhere where there is a vaccine. So she's describing how immigrants are being vaccinated at lower rates because they just don't have the time to take off work for 2 hours to, go to a vaccine. There's not a lot of transportation, and it was like that before. But once again, COVID-19, you need to get to where there's a vaccine. You need a vaccine to protect yourself, and it's not a level playing field for them. And then here, Jenny Butcher, she is a disabled woman who feels that she has not been given adequate information that specifically pertains to her. She expressed not knowing what to do if her caretaker gets sick, not knowing how to tackle social distancing with a caretaker. And she said, "Hardly anything has been done to protect disabled women. In fact, the opposite is true. Disabled women are being abandoned and left to die." So all these quotes really encompass how COVID-19 has exposed a lot of faults in our society and made them worse.
Our second finding was that storytelling reveals invisible trauma. So through storytelling, women were able to reveal their invisible trauma that resulted from the pandemic. While many physical damages emerged from COVID, such as a stressed economy and loss of life, the pandemic caused invisible trauma to many individuals, especially those in marginalized groups. Invisible trauma is described as lacking clear scientific protocol and standardized assessment techniques and make damages difficult to translate into monetary terms. Examples of invisible trauma include isolation, loneliness, and mental health disparities. Women face mental health issues, isolation, and stress during the pandemic. In their personal narratives, women described their invisible trauma with phrases such as isolated, devastated, scared, worried, struggle, and breaking point. In total, there were 10 references to how COVID-19 caused invisible trauma. Invisible trauma was exacerbated by the childcare crisis, leaving many women to juggle childcare and working from home or having to leave their jobs altogether. Domestic abuse was more prevalent during the lockdowns. Many victims were unable to access the resources available to them, resulting in increased feelings of isolation and fear. One of the women in our research said, "A victim of domestic abuse is already at a heightened sense of fear. So imagine being isolated with your abuser all day, every day." Lastly, in the United States, nurses are predominantly women, and nurses faced extreme fear and frustration throughout the peak pandemic period, and the PTSD they experienced was compared to what soldiers in combat face. While our findings were focused on women, this finding can be applied to individuals in the LGBTQIA+ community, individuals with disabilities, and immigrants. Josue Turbiates said, "It's just like, what do I do now?" It causes so much of that self-doubt, anxiety, and depression when describing how he felt about lockdowns. And Turbiates is a member of the LGBTQ+ community. People with disabilities were more likely to experience social isolation and loneliness during the pandemic. Parodi, a quadriplegic from Virginia, said, "For our marginalized community, it feels like fighting against Goliath." Brathwaite, a detained immigrant from Trinidad, discussed his fears about not getting vaccinated while imprisoned. "Honestly, I'm scared. I don't want to be the first one to die here." All of these examples show that storytelling is effective for marginalized groups to reveal invisible trauma. Our third finding was that storytelling inspires hope amongst vulnerable groups. Women in Virginia were able to inspire hope amongst vulnerable groups by sharing the actions they took that were successful or possible solutions and resources for others facing similar hardships. When individuals share their success stories, it inspires others to seek help and resources. In their personal narratives, women use phrases such as "don't give up hope," "presents an opportunity," "changes are coming," and "on the horizon" to inspire hope in vulnerable groups. In total, there were 17 statements that inspired hope in women's personal narratives. For example, Christina Moraza, a survivor of abusive relationship, shared her story and told women, "Don't give up. You can get out of a relationship and get a better life." This finding can relate to people in the LGBTQIA+ community, people with disabilities, and immigrants. So while Josue Turbiates shared his invisible trauma in the last slide, in the same article, Dr. Wilson, a member of the LGBTQ+ community, shared positivity and hope in the community with the message, "We know how to build our community in creative ways, and we know how to develop a sense of pride in ourselves." And while many people with disabilities faced extreme challenges during the pandemic, others found positive change, like Mikhail, who was able to delay aging out of public school due to missed time during the pandemic. He said that if he and other students could get back to missed services, it would be extremely helpful. Lastly, Virginia allowed Medicaid access to immigrants due to the pandemic, and one grandson shared his excitement that his grandma could get proper care. "I can't wait for her to get a proper medical checkup, the needs that she needs to have a living condition she deserves." All of these examples demonstrate how marginalized communities use storytelling to inspire hope in their communities. From these findings, our recommendations is that policymakers actively engage with vulnerable communities pre, during, and post-crisis. They must recognize that everyone does not experience crisis in the same ways and adjust our management process accordingly. These are examples of catering crisis communication strategies to marginalized communities' individual needs. So an example for women could be to allot more funding to support the influx of people relying on women's shelters and emergency response hotlines. For the LGBTQIA community, we could develop a Q&A to explain how vaccines interact with medications, such as medications for hormone replacement therapy or HIV. Individuals with disabilities, we could tailor the designs of crisis communication protocols to suit various accessibility needs by using Braille, large text, headers, and sans serif fonts that are easier to read. And for immigrants, we could disseminate a crisis communication strategy in a variety of languages and translate messages from the federal government. To review all of our recommendations, view our crisis communication strategy on our web exhibition. So an important note to remember as we reflect on our project is that when things return to normal, if that ever happens, marginalized communities may feel the effects of the pandemic for longer than other communities and have a harder time bouncing back. And although we focus on the pandemic, the hardships that marginalized communities face are not just during pandemics, but during other crises and even during everyday life. More research is needed to understand how marginalized communities are affected by other disasters and how they will recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The research conducted for this project allowed us to connect class concepts to real life. We were taught during class that marginalized communities suffered more during disasters, but this research allowed us to understand that in a real world setting that was close to home in Virginia. Lastly, by working collaboratively throughout this project, we learned real world skills as working as a team and appreciated the background information we both brought to the table. More information on our experience researching will be available on our website. So this is a preview of our web exhibition where you can find all the information that we spoke about today and much more. We have included the challenges these marginalized groups face and opportunities. Our findings are expanded in this section, the research findings section. There it is. And our crisis communication recommendations for pre, during, and post-crisis is expanded here. Lastly, you'll find major takeaways in our bio and more information about our experience throughout this research project. And we wanted to give a big shout out to Daniel Tobin, Scott Fralin, and Dr. Sylvester Johnson in the Center of Humanities and Center for Communicating Science for your support throughout this process. And an extra special thanks to our professor, Sweta Benia, and thank you to all of the guests that join us today.
Thank you so much, Leah and Kylie. That was amazing. Now can we move on to Haley and Christine?
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so first of all, we just want to thank everyone for joining. And we want to thank the Center for Humanities and the Center for Communicating Science and Dr. Banya for setting all this up. So to start off, my name is Haley Wade. I am a senior majoring in English and professional technical writing with a minor in strategic communication. And this is Christine.
Hi, I'm Christine, and I am also a senior majoring in professional and technical writing.
And so this is our project. So we did research on the analysis of a Facebook group during the 2020 California Lake Fire and how grassroots organizers communicate during crisis.
So this is our agenda for today's presentation. We're going to start off with some background about our research and methodology, and then we're going to move on to findings and recommendations gathered from our research, and we'll close out with a reflection about our research experience.
Okay, so an introduction to our research. So we analyzed qualitative aspects of the California wildfires information alert Facebook group. And this was specifically, we looked at Facebook posts during the 2020 California Lake Fire. And we did this to understand how effectively the Facebook group handles crisis communication. And so by studying the effectiveness of communication during the lake fires, it's important to, due to the high frequency of wildfires in California.
So some background on the 2020 California Lake Fire. It was a wildfire that occurred in the Lake Hughes region of Los Angeles County, California. The fire began in August of 2020 and was fully contained in September of 2020. The lake fire spread covered over 31,000 acres, and it caused building damage and destruction along with non-fatal injury. Furthermore, there were multiple evacuations conducted due to the fire, including evacuations of public schools and roads.
So a little bit about the Facebook group itself. The California Wildfires Information Alert Facebook group is a public Facebook group, which means that anyone on or off of Facebook, if they have an account or not, can view this Facebook page. And so it also has over 6,900 members, which is a very substantial amount. And on the actual about page on the Facebook page, it says that they are dedicated to distributing information via social media to the general public and rescue teams in regards to civil emergency messages, weather warnings, road conditions, needs, etc.
So these were our main research objectives. We wanted to determine what strategies are most effective for crisis communication on social media, understand how grassroots organizers can facilitate discourse on social media during a crisis, and use our findings to develop strategies grassroots organizers can use to create spaces for and empower marginalized voices. All right, so going into our research methods, the data we used were 31 data selections from the California Wildfires Information Alert Facebook group. 24 of these selections were Facebook posts from the time period of the California Lake Fire, and 6 of these selections were logistical elements such as group rules.
So in order to determine our research themes, Dr. Banya helped us come up with an activity to do coding to figure out our themes. So basically this narrowed the scope of themes to focus on during the qualitative analysis that we conducted. And so coding was done from actual posts that we found on the California Wildfires Information Alert Facebook group. And so our themes were moderation and regulation, data information, and content interaction. And so in this image here, you can see the sticky notes that we used just to really map out our thoughts.
So from our 3 major themes, we developed 3 questions to focus on during our research. Our research questions asked how do moderation/regulation, data information, and interaction impact the effectiveness of crisis communication in the California Wildfires Information Alert Facebook group.
So some of our findings, to start off with the moderation and regulation, we found that it actually improves effectiveness. So Christina and I both tried to join the group just to see what it would look like. And we found that upon requesting to join, Facebook users are prompted with some questions. And so these are you in California? Why do you want to join our group? And would you like to join our group of volunteers and moderators? And so these questions are put there just to really cut down on users posting unrelated topics and people who really probably shouldn't be in the Facebook page. And then also we found that there are lots of privacy settings, but in particular, this particular group's Facebook page is set to public. So this means that anyone on or off Facebook can access the contents of the page, but that doesn't mean that they can post. It still has to go through the moderators and the administrators. And so this really increases accessibility of crisis communication to the public. Now everyone that wants to view it can view it, which is very helpful in crisis communication. And then so on the actual about page for the Facebook group, it says that the Facebook moderators and administrators adhere to HIPAA guidelines. This is a big deal because it shows that they are aware of private information and the rules against that. And then also HIPAA themselves, they prohibit the disclosure of any text, images, or videos of named patients on social media networks without explicit consent.
So moving on to our next finding, through our research, we determined that data information also improved the effectiveness of crisis communication in the Facebook group. So the inclusion of things such as hashtags, timestamps, number of acres each fire is spread, containment percentages, location, and images were seen on numerous posts in the Facebook group. These aspects all increased effectiveness by improving the clarity of Facebook posts. So for example, images provide readers with a visual idea of the severity of a fire. And in that same vein, containment percentages and other numbers provide readers with a quantitative idea of the severity of a fire.
And then, so as far as interaction goes, for content interaction, we found that it also improves effectiveness. Overall, interaction seen on the California Wildfires Information Alert page, there was a lot of different kinds of interaction. For example, comments. They increased effectiveness by encouraging discourse among users, which means people are sharing their experiences, they're sharing what they're seeing in real time, which is beneficial. And it's also creating that sense of community so that users are able to relate with one another. Emoji reactions, that's something interesting that Facebook provides to its users. It increased effectiveness by providing users with ways to express their emotional reactions towards a post in a clear manner instead of just liking. And then ability for users to actually share the posts. This increased effectiveness by expanding the network of users who received crisis communications. So this means that basically, if you wanted to share the post, it would go on your page, and then people who are not members of the Facebook group were able to see it. And then we also found that the like reaction actually decreased effectiveness just due to its ambiguity, and it just really caused more confusion.
All right, so first we're going to start off with recommendations that we came up with for the Facebook page itself. So our first recommendation for the Facebook group is to encourage the use of the emoji reaction over the like reaction. So expanding from what Haley said, there are several emoji reactions with names including care, wow, sad, and angry. In comparison, the like button is much more ambiguous. For example, a user leaving a like on a Facebook post could be interpreted in numerous ways, including that they're celebrating the presented information, that they're agreeing with the presented information, or that they're merely acknowledging the information. So you could see how the ambiguity of likes may lead to misinterpretations, especially when it comes to dealing with sensitive information that's often associated with crisis communication. So encouraging group members to use emoji reactions instead of the like reaction would combat some of that ambiguity.
And so then our second recommendation is to require content to contain sufficient and cohesive information. And so basically from this, we're just saying that this content that we would suggest that they would require would still be approved by the administration of the Facebook page, which is something that they already kind of have in place, but this would just be an extra step to ensure that all the requirements are met. So potential requirements that we came up with, the location of the fire should be clearly represented in the post. The group was pretty good about this, but just ensuring that it's in every single post is really going to help people out who are looking to utilize that information. And then also mentioning posts that mention acreage should also include information about containment. This is really important because if you're just mentioning how large the fire is, but not mentioning how much it's been contained, it might cause confusion for some users. And then also timestamps of any updates should be a mandatory thing to add to posts, just so that users know what information is the most update and they're making sure that they're getting all the information they need.
So from our research, we also developed a wildfire crisis communication plan for non-official groups in the United States. This plan details strategies for communication before, during, and after a crisis. The main objectives for this plan were spreading awareness of wildfire safety, checking for accuracy of information, ensuring accessibility, and challenging the dominant narrative. Some key strategies noted in our communication plan include utilizing voices and information from official organizations. This ensures that communication from non-official groups is accurate and up-to-date, and also works to combat the spread of misinformation. Another strategy is to create spaces for and empower voices that tend to be marginalized during a crisis, such as women and BIPOC. So this includes creating specific social media groups or Slack channels for these groups that will facilitate discourse, including conversation about any issues prevalent in existing crisis communication. Finally, non-official groups should ensure crisis communicators are well educated on issues including wildfire and wildfire safety, accessibility, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. This will aid in ensuring that crisis communication released is inclusive and effective. Some strategies for this include developing modules that potential communicators must pass before being granted the ability to release content. Furthermore, non-official groups should provide their crisis communicators with a list of educational resources that is consistently updated so that resources do not fall out of date.
And so next, we have our web exhibition. And so basically this page just shows more of our research and an in-depth look and recommendations in a digital format that's publicly accessible so that you guys can see it. And then I was going to show what it looks like. Well, I think it's pulled over here. Yes, so this is our webpage. I'm just going to scroll through really quick. You'll see that it's basically everything we have in this presentation, but it's in a more in-depth look, and we would love for you guys to take a look at it. And so then moving on to our major takeaways. So to start off, understanding how social media plays a key role in, understanding how social media plays a key role in crisis communication. This is huge because social media is a huge part of our lives now. And just by doing this research, we were really able to understand how Facebook especially plays a role, and how these small and large Facebook groups are playing an active role in crisis communication.
So one of my major takeaways from our research was just how prevalent wildfires are, not only in California, but in all of the United States. The high frequency of wildfires really emphasized to me the importance of efficient, accessible, and inclusive crisis communication, not only during a crisis, but during the pre-crisis and post-crisis stages.
And so then also just understanding various aspects of social media. So we were able to do a lot of research on just how Facebook works in general. So this means like the Facebook groups and like some of the regulations that they have put in place that are specifically meant to help user experience. They want to make it easy to use. They want to make it beneficial to everyone to look at, and also privacy settings, just making sure that we're protecting everyone using, and just really trying to give everyone the best experience.
So this concludes our presentation. We want to give a special thank you to Daniel Tobin, Scott Frowlin, Dr. Bonilla, Dr. Johnson, the Center for Humanities, and the Center for Communicating Science for making this presentation and our research possible.
Thank you so much, Christine and Haley.
Those are terrific panelists. Thank you so much. Really excellent presentations and just very fascinating research that is examining the importance of these communication infrastructures within the context of such, I think, meticulous attention to the social realities. So it's a testament to the work you've done, Dr. Bonilla, with the students, and to the panelists. Again, really amazing work for you as well. And we have questions from our audience. Again, I want to remind everyone in the audience, if you can send us your questions and comments, you can just click that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and do that. But we have some already on queue. And one of these questions is for Kylie and Leah. The LGBTQIA community in the US was one of the earliest groups to achieve a very high COVID vaccination rate last summer. And this was despite low rates of vaccination among other marginalized groups. So the question is, do you think that storytelling within this community contributed to high vaccination rates? And do you think that storytelling might help researchers and public health responders to understand these quantitative differences in vaccination rates?
Sure. So I think storytelling lends its hand to high vaccination rates. We've seen media houses use storytelling from non-marginalized groups to promote vaccine rates. So, for example, the Daily Mail article that we spoke about in this presentation. And storytelling can persuade people to do certain things because people are more likely to take issues more seriously when they're humanized, or they're also more likely to trust people within their community. So it would be a good idea for public health officials to partner with prominent local community groups. But while we've seen that storytelling can help those within non-marginalized groups with vaccination rates, this is one of the areas where we need more research. And, that would be a really great research question, is to understand how storytelling relates to the LGBTQIA community.
Also kind of backing off of that, we also, like Leah mentioned, public health officials should pay attention to what these marginalized groups are saying. We also shared a quote from a community member speaking on behalf of the immigrant community on how they're not getting vaccinated because they don't have access to transportation, they don't have the time to take off of work. So you should really pay attention to, it would be even better to speak with someone directly about that if you could create a way to have an open dialogue with them without any fear being present. So if we really pay attention to what these groups are saying, we can tailor our crisis management strategies to their needs.
That's great. We have another question for the South Sudan group. And the question is, what did you learn about how women currently communicate effectively in the absence of literacy, and any specific community networks or informal but effective systems? And did you learn anything about whether literacy programs are increasing?
So our research showed that word of mouth was a huge factor in the way women specifically communicate. And it's actually a very unique phenomena about how, specifically because most of these groups live in rural areas, how they're able to spread the information that they hear. The problem is, though, is that the information that they hear is unreliable because it is coming from a small group of very propagandized sources. So do you want to take?
Yeah, on top of that, there is the issue of like culturally, a lot of the time, women and men are not supposed to interact, especially if they are unmarried, and sharing their opinions is sort of frowned upon in society. So it would be interesting to see a forum where women were able to interact with each other on a larger basis and interact with everyone and amplify their voices.
And to discuss the programs, our research showed very little emphasis on establishing any kind of programs for women and for good communication and knowledge, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one program that there was, the CPA, it had all these promises to give women a place in government and to give them a voice, but unfortunately, those promises were not fulfilled.
Well, thank you. We have another question from our audience. It's first thanking you for the wonderful presentations and noting that you chose very different crisis situations to study. So the question is, how did you select your topics?
We can start.
You can go.
Okay. Well,
we did a quick search, found South Sudan rather quickly, actually, when looking at international crises, and we're immediately just grew compassion for the terrible things that are happening, the very complex pile on top of pile on top of pile of crisis happening to these citizens.
Yeah, we decided that we wanted to focus on a disaster that was occurring internationally. And we sort of just started, I know it sounds basic, but just looked up like international crises in 2021. And the flooding and famine were the first things that came up in South Sudan. And from there, our project really grew.
For Haley and I, we researched a Facebook group during the 2020 California lake fires. I think a big reason for that was because actually when we researched trying to find communications from a lot of more official or government organizations, it was pretty difficult to find them readily available online, which maybe speaks to a bigger issue there. But we saw a lot of discourse on social media. And I think in today's age, it's a huge, huge advantage that that crisis communicators can take advantage of for crisis communication, because pretty much everyone has social media, and it's a great way to help connect those more official organizations to regular people.
So Leah and I picked our topic because it's kind of an intersection of all of our interests. So obviously we all went through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we saw it kind of play out on social media and people sharing their experiences on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. So we already had an interest in examining people's experiences during COVID. And also as women, we wanted to particularly examine them and see what they have to say about their experience during COVID.
Great. So thank you, all of you. There's another question that is asking how these projects may have affected what all of you might wish to pursue in your professional careers and future work. So any comments there?
Yeah, I have a comment. So I am a professional and technical writing and public relations major, but I'm going to go more into the public relations sphere. And I think it's really important for me to understand how to communicate with marginalized groups, because if you speak to the whole world, you're not getting to those specific groups that are so important to reach. So this project just made me realize certain strategies that I can use to really reach those people.
Great, thank you.
So,
yeah, go ahead, Haley.
I was just gonna say, for me, I'm really interested in social media. I'll have a minor in strategic communication, and so I think social media is a huge part of our world, and it's definitely something that I want to work in. And knowing how it helps crisis communication, I think it was really interesting and something that I really benefited from researching.
I like the more creative aspect of it. I like designing the website. Obviously, I liked researching the topic too, but it just makes me feel like I want to maybe explore a career that allows me to have like more of a creative outlet.
For me, I'm looking to go into technical writing, either in a government industry or the tech industry. I think this project, just as a general takeaway, really emphasized how much weight there is in our writing and how much of an impact it has on people, and how it can really help to empower and to lift people up, even if it doesn't seem like you're writing anything too important. All communication that goes out has the ability to empower people's voices during a crisis and during any type of communication that you might be releasing.
Coming into this course, I knew that I wanted to be a grant writer. And in grant writing, I wanted to work with nonprofits specifically. But I didn't realize that there are so many intricacies in disaster and in disaster communication. And even just realizing that like there are countries where literacy rates aren't high, so you need to prioritize non-written forms of communication, such as radio or visualizations or things like that. So this course really, I feel like, opened me up to the other side of potential nonprofit work that that will help me in the future.
Similarly, I don't see myself going into a specific crisis communication field, but the skills that I developed in conducting this project has taken me out of my academic comfort zone in the best way. And they're skills that I feel I will definitely take with me anywhere that I go, whether it's writing related or not. So I'm very grateful to this class and the skills I'm able to have now.
Yeah, and Kate, you're writing a book.
Yes, I am currently writing a book. Hopefully I will have it published by the end of next year and everything. But it does focus a lot on disaster communication, more so with what Kylie and Leah were looking at, and was kind of born out of COVID-19. And so looking at like disaster communication and the way that people understand knowledge in our world. So that's really exciting too.
Those are all terrific responses, very inspiring. And we have another question that's asking for all of you about how you might imagine using discourse analysis or storytelling in the future. And this could be at a personal level, it could be in some type of professional work environment. But any thoughts about that?
I can start. So I also want to be a technical writer. And I feel like storytelling acts as a needs assessment. So I feel like moving forward in my career, I will try to think creatively to use storytelling in the workplace, maybe finding a way to, contact the company's consumers and customers to see what do they expect out of the company and its products, using storytelling to, work with subject matter experts. So I feel like it's very relevant to the field of technical communication.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and again, as I was saying, in public relations, for example, I work a lot with organizations trying to bring more education opportunities to marginalized communities. And so part of the way that they do that is by telling stories of success stories where students went to STEM camps or, women in STEM. And by allowing students and children to see these people that are almost role models sharing their stories, it allows more people to believe that they can go into those education spheres. So I think that I'll apply things like that to my work in the future.
Great. Any others?
I also, this is a little bit more on a personal note, but absolutely love reading biographies and autobiographies. I feel like I'm just at a very transitory age in my life. And so being able to hear how other people's lives unfolded and just their own perspective, it's been very rewarding in broadening my own perspective. And I think that that's something that is very useful in the workplace as well, just as much as in personal life.
I feel like, working in the nonprofit sector and everything, I do feel very passionate about climate change. And I think that as time goes on and everything, it's going to be even more important to prioritize personal narratives from countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change and spreading those sorts of narratives. So I hope that it is something I get to keep doing and working with and on in my future.
For me, this is piggybacking a little bit off of what Kylie said in technical communication. I think the stuff I learned in this course in regards to storytelling can be helpful in that vein and also in my personal life. Understanding how supporting aspects of text like visuals and figures can really help to elevate text and storytelling was a really big takeaway I took away from this.
And so then for me, I would say learning that marginalized voices are an extremely crucial part on social media. I think that's a big deal, just making sure that everyone has a platform. Something that we discovered was a lot of the information that came out around the California wildfires focused on celebrities a lot. And so just knowing that everyone needs to have a platform because you can learn a lot from all different types of people was really important. And it's definitely something that I'm going to take with me in my future career.
That's terrific. Also, before we go, I'd like to turn to Dr. Bonilla and ask you if you'd like to share anything about the design of the course or your own perspectives on both the projects that students have done and also this larger question of the role of communications within the context of disasters.
Thank you so much for asking that question. I think the students did a terrific work and their presentations definitely show how much they have worked throughout this semester. So my goal in teaching this course was to be able to teach how disasters that happen locally or regionally within the US and globally affect communities that are marginalized, and how technical communicators can become crucial in communicating crisis, because we don't know when crisis can happen and when an organization has a crisis or when we have large crisis like a pandemic. So I think my goal was to prepare the students for their future career as crisis communicators, whether or not their focus would be to communicating crisis only, but just to be prepared whenever there is a need. So I think that was the goal, and I think I have fulfilled that goal. But so the design of the class, the crucial aspect of the class was working on open knowledge platform and curating open knowledge, because during the crisis, what's more effective is that what I have found with my own research as well as my own experiences is that open knowledge sources are utilized more, and we need to strengthen that quite a bit. So what we did as a class is we started by editing Wikipedia, that the students didn't cover because this was their final project, but we started with editing Wikipedia and trying to find accurate information from various specific sources And then the students were involved in editing Wikipedia with like a lot of, like they did a lot of stylistic changes, informational changes, and also changes on the based on sources. A lot of them also created some paragraphs and writing so that people can have access to things like vaccine. And those projects were a lot varied as well. And then we moved on to this project, which also has a public facing aspect, which is the website itself, because what I wanted them to have is not just whatever they are researching in the class to be open to the public to see, but also the crisis communication strategies that they have developed can be easily downloaded by people who need. And since this website is public, it's accessible to a lot of people who might, search for crisis communication strategies online. And the reason that so one of the questions was, how did they design this, like choose this topic? So one thing that I restricted was I wanted them to study local, regional, and international disasters. So that's how they chose their topics based on that limitation. So whoever, if some people search for local crisis communication strategies, it's there, regional, it's there, and international, it's there. So altogether, I think I wanted to hit those nodes.
Great. Well, this is amazing work. I want to thank all of you for such a wonderful set of presentations and sharing this knowledge with us. I think it's especially notable that all of you are not only examining these challenges, you've offered some very promising strategies in order to move things forward. And it's certainly been enlightening to hear Dr. Benia, you and all of these teams as well, to talk about and demonstrate the immense importance of communications networks, of communication cultures and practices in the context of these very, very harmful and really urgent disasters. So that's been very valuable as well. Thanks so much to all of you. I want to thank our audience for terrific and engaging questions and comments. So glad you can join us. So tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we will have a webinar with an invited speaker, Oludamini Ogunaike, who's talking about the work of Frantz Fanon and Sylvia Wynter in combination with some of the intellectual traditions emerged from African Islamic communities and Ifa traditions. So please join us for that. It's a really amazing and fascinating insight into the connections between philosophy and race and religion and culture. So thank all of you again, and we're so glad you could join the Center for Humanities and this program. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.